I'm going to go over some staining and glazing.
Come on!
First thing is equipment when it comes to staining and glazing. I can't stress more two things. One, having a good tile. We either use a white tile or a black tile. The reason for that is I don't want to have any colors influence as I'm looking at the colors. So a clean tile that you can get from Home Depot, Lowe's or something. And then the next thing are brushes. You really have to make sure you're spending some money on brushes. I know you can get some cheaper ones like at the craft store or something, but really you should look through the dental catalogs, dental lab catalogs to get Sable brushes. Now this is National Keystone. They're not very expensive. This is a 0, and you can always see the sizes right here. And these are artificial brushes, and they're okay, but they just don't last very long. What I want you to notice on this 0 brush, that it's flared out quite a bit. Now, these will last, but they're just going to wear out over time. The way you sharpen these is you take like a little bit of diluting liquid or build-up liquid or alcohol. Just put a little bit on your fingers, and you can wipe through this, and you turn it, and as you're turning it, it will sharpen up. The problem with these artificial brushes is it's hard to get them sharp. So the brushes that I use, in fact, this brush right here, I bet I've painted 1,000 different restorations with this one. This is a Vita Kolinsky Sable brush, and it's a 00. I've used it so much it doesn't even have the label on it anymore, but this is the reason why I like this one so much. Just picking it up, you can tell that it's already sharp. And as I take that liquid and put it right over there and sharpen it up, you can see how tight that is. And again, a Kolinsky Sable brush really does well when it comes to ceramics. Just from trivia, a Sable is a type of weasel, and a Kolinsky Sable is a weasel that's found in Russia, of all things, and it comes off the tail. And I'm not even sure if it's a male or a female. I think it's a male Kolinsky Sables. But anyway, they breed them in Russia for brushes. Make sure you spend the money on getting this. You may think, well, those are kind of expensive, but they'll last a long time. So like this one, this is a #1 Sable brush from Ivoclar Vivident. A little bit bigger brush, but again, I've used this countless times, and this keeps its shape. The tail fibers stay straight. The other thing is, when it comes to brushes, when you're looking at sizes, in our little world of staining and glazing, the last thing we need are gigantic brushes. So when you're looking in the catalog and you see a kit that comes with, a bunch of different brushes, you'll probably never even use those brushes. They're just too big. Like for instance, this is a #4, National Keystone #4, and it's very straight, but it's an artificial brush. But I mean, this thing is huge. This is made for stacking ceramic, like on a bridge or something. I mean, if you think about it, putting glaze across a crown this big, I mean, you're just going to douse it. It's way too large. So I recommend about the biggest size you want to go is a 0 brush when it comes to staining and glazing. And again, a 00 brush like this Vita Kolinsky Sable brush, you can't beat. There's many different manufacturers, but make sure you get a high quality one. Maybe, I don't know, $10 to $15 for something like this. It'll last you a long time. One of the things that in our training classes I get a lot of is like, hey doc, how come I get so many bubbles in my glaze? Well, whenever you see bubbles in glaze, you should automatically think contamination. One, contamination can come from oils in your fingers or the oil in the milling chambers if you haven't rinsed off the crown very well or used alcohol to wipe it off. The residue from that can make it burn out during the fire and leave bubbles. But by far, the most common contaminant is this. It's the diluting liquid. Diluting liquid, this bottle right here will last you your entire career, I bet. But what we want to do as dentists is, here, we bought this bottle, we want to use it. So what we think is we need to take a drop, put it in with the glaze, and then start mixing. But the problem is you've not been shown how to actually mix glaze to see if it's even right. So I'm gonna show that. In your oven, if you've ever accidentally fired like a composite crown and it burns up in there, there's a lot of organics that get up inside that muffle. You want to super burn this, like fire it over and over and over again to burn out any of the contaminants, especially if you know you did that. Another thing is we keep our ovens away from the areas that we polish in our lab, because when you're polishing, a lot of dust gets generated. Or definitely keep this away from the lathe, because there's a lot of debris that's coming off the stone and coming up in the air, so you don't want to get the oven contaminated. Do the best you can to keep any air contaminants away, especially like acrylics from dentures. Anyway, we're going to go to mixing glaze. We're going to use this Emax CAD, the crystal glaze, because a lot of you are using Emax. So the first thing you're going to do is obviously take off the cap, and we're going to squirt out some of this. Now, I've trained a lot of doctors on how to do this very thing, and the first thing they do is they squirt out about this much. There's a tiny little bit, and you're going to mix this up and determine how big all this is. And just to give you a reference, here's a crown we're going to use. This is wrong. You need to get a good amount out. And the reason for this is I want to be able to mix this a lot. I've had dental assistants come up to me and say, no, the doctor gets mad at me if I put too much out. Well, we're not wasting this. We can use this over and over again. In fact, this can sit overnight, even though it evaporates and dries out. You can always take diluting liquid and reconstitute, so you don't waste it. But the problem is if you're not mixing it properly and seeing it mixed, then you may get a bad glaze, or you might get bubbles in your glaze, and we don't want that. We want to make sure we're evaluating it properly. So the first thing, take a lot of it out. Chances are the syringe, when you've expressed it out, it's probably right. The only time you really need to add diluting liquid is if it's a stain that you haven't used much in the last couple years and is just sitting there and kind of gets dried out. You'll see that these stains, like this one's Mahogany, I'm not going to go through this in a year, so it's going to dry out more. You're going to have to dilute this. So the glaze tends to be used more often. All right, so the first thing is grab like a zero brush. This will be plenty to see if it's glazed, if the glaze is right. What you need to do is really mix this around. Just the action of this will make the solvent within the glaze work around the ceramics of it, and then you just let it rest. Now this is just about right. You can see that it's holding its shape, but it's not a very defined line within the glaze. So this is about right. I'd rather err on it being a little bit too thick than ever it being too runny, because then it's not going to give me a good glaze. So I'm inclined to use the diluting liquid. Last thing I'm going to do is take a drop and put it right on the top of it. I want to put it over to the side and just put a little drop over here. Now it's hard to see on this black, but you'll get the idea. I'm going to take that brush and just get a little bit of it inside the brush and then start mixing into the glaze. And what you're going to see is this is going to start to relax greatly. As I'm mixing this, I'm trying to push it back into a little circle. And as I'm mixing it, you're going to see that it starts to relax. Like I can't keep it in its proper shape. That's good. That means it's starting to dissipate. The reason why you want that is because as I'm putting it on the crown, I want it to slightly slump as it's going over the crown. If it's so thick that it's staying in its a gelled consistency, you're going to have a bunch of brush strokes all over it. So I would say that this is a well-mixed glaze right here. So let's take a stain. I'm going to talk about all the stains that we use in our office here in a minute. The number 2 comes in the Emax Crystallization stains, or you can get this for Empress. Honestly, I think it's the same stuff, just different packaging. But this number 2 is a really nice brown. It's a very general brown, and then we go up or down from that. The higher the numbers, the darker it gets. So number 2 is a good little brown here. I'll move this crown over. Obviously, you want to keep the stain separate from our glaze. You're going to see that it's even harder for me to squirt this out, and that's just because it's not used as much. Always put the cap back on. Make sure it's set and tight so it doesn't dry out. Now, in our classes, we always teach our students, don't mix your glaze brush. Dedicate one of your brushes for glaze only. So I'm going to set this one aside. This is a 0 brush. I'm going to set that one aside. And then just pick up another one. This is another 0 brush. But again, I want to follow the same rules. I'm going to mix this first. And obviously, this is going to be too thick. I mean, look how clumpy this is. For those doctors that remember how to mix zinc phosphate, remember how we mix those in different sections and then we draw it up on the spatula? It's kind of like that. You want to see it draw up, but not like zinc phosphate. You want it to be more runny than that. So this is obviously too much. Now I'm going to take this brush and go right over to the diluting liquid over here, but so I don't get a bunch of stain in there, I'm just going to take my fingers and wipe this out. And I have a little 2x2. Get that off the fingers, or you can use it to wipe off the brush. You can do this over and over. In fact, we always keep an alcohol 2x2 nearby just for that. So we use one of these little alcohol bottles. It's really easy to dispense. Just click this a couple times, gets a little bit of alcohol in here. Then we can just wipe that out. It's a quick way to clean it. It's not a totally clean brush, but at least it's not getting a lot of stain in the diluting liquid. So we'll go back to the diluting liquid, take just a little bit of that into the stain, and you're going to see this relax quickly. Again, when you push it back into its shape, it should feel like it's pushing down, or it's flowing down just a little bit. What you don't want to see it is look like this. So I'm going to add too much, just as a demonstration. I'm going to put a big drop on this. So that was one drop of the diluting liquid. As I mix this around, it's going to be really runny. You may say, well, I want this thinned out. Yeah, of course you want it thinned out, but when you put it on in the restoration, it may be so thin it just doesn't hold up, and you fire it and you don't see a result with it. So this is much too runny for this. It's just not going to look that great, or you're going to have less control over the stain. So I'll take that, and never be afraid to erase things on your palette. So there that goes. See you later. Goodbye, brown number 2. And this, again, just with alcohol, it'll evaporate off. So we'll lay down the number 2 again. And again, don't be afraid to put more out than you know you're going to use. Like, this is enough brown to do like 8, maybe 10 restorations. But again, I want to be able to mix it and see that it's mixed properly. So just a little bit of that diluting liquid. And we should be ready to go. You can never overmix these. In fact, one of the problems is if you undermix it, then the diluting liquid isn't dispersed throughout the stain very well, and that would be a poor mistake to make. All right, so we have a glaze set, and we also have a number 2 brown set. One thing I want you to notice is glaze is not clear. In fact, people get confused by this. They think glaze is clear because it's a clear surface. That isn't the case at all. If you look at this black tile with the white on there, if it was clear, it would be black. The reason why I mention this is that if you put too much glaze on a restoration, thinking you're going to make it glossier, you could potentially be adding value to the restoration or leaving white streaks within the restoration, which is not good. So you want it diluted properly so that when you put it on, you're not changing the value very much. Now, if you want to do that, if you want to increase the value, make it whiter, there's another glaze I want to talk about later. But in general, you want this to be the same consistency and not added too much. So let's say this bothers you, leaving the glaze and the stains on your tile and leaving it overnight. I can understand that. It is evaporating. There could be dust in the air and it's collecting on here. We don't want that. If you go to different lab sites, supply sites on the internet, you can buy something that looks like this. This is basically a big tile. Lab technicians use this a lot. And what you do is you put the colors within the little wells here, and you can dilute it better in these areas. And I've even marked it to where hey, this is the number 2, or this is number 3, or the translucent, or whatever, and that will be forever and ever the home for this color. And then the best part of it, it comes with a lid that goes on top of it. So now it's protected and it's going to evaporate less. But this would be one solution. And they make big ones and smaller ones. Quite frankly, with as little amounts that we used, I kind of quit using that because it took up too much of my table. And I just use the little tile that you see here. And worst case scenario, we put a paper towel over it. And next day we're using it. I'm dispersing a little bit more glaze. But again, the point is, don't be chintzy when you're putting this out because we want to make sure it's glazed properly. Let's do a turbo crown. I call this a turbo crown in our office, which means, hey, I don't want it to look monochromatic, but we need a little bit of color on it, a little bit of depth, but we don't want to spend 18 minutes on jazzing it up because this is for an upper second molar or maybe a lower first molar that doesn't need a lot of characterization, but we want to have a little bit of depth. So first thing is we're going to take out our Emax, and we have a sprue right here. We got to get that sprue off. Now, first, let me move this so I don't get any of the dust in here. Now, we use a particular burr in our office. I invented this a couple years ago. It's called the Sprue Removal System. Wagner Rotary makes this for us. They're a really high quality burr manufacturer. And what it does is there's a white component, and what the white component does is it rips the sprue off really fast, and then the blue component polishes, or it even kind of burnishes the blue Emax. And so if you're not really sure if the sprue is off completely, you just take the blue and it will polish that area, and you go, oh, okay, I need to take some more of that off. What you're going to see right now is the white portion going right over the sprue. When you're taking the sprue off, I highly suggest it going across the sprue rather than through the sprue, because if you do it like this, it will gouge out whatever polishing system you're using. So go across it. Now right now I don't know how much of that sprue is on there, and if I just quickly go to the blue side, you'll see that this starts to get polished up. And any areas that are still out for the sprue, this will hit it first because it's higher up. And then with light finger pressure, you can get the rest of it off where it's clean. So once you see that it's entirely shiny right in through here, we know that the sprue has been completely removed. The other important thing is if you wanted to jazz up for anatomy just a little bit, it'd be to take a diamond burr, and it's usually an inverted cone burr. Now this is the one we use. This is a pretty big inverted diamond burr. You'd think, well, smaller would be better. Well, over the years I've converted in using a bigger inverted cone because this corner off the inverted cone, it just stays sharper longer. You'd be more likely inclined to use a burr that looks like this, like a double inverted cone. Okay, and they're great. They're pretty sharp, but even this one you can see they wear out really fast. And the last thing I want to do is use a worn out double inverted cone to redefine my fissures, because what happens, it leaves the little black line to it. In fact, this one's worn out. It looks like, I'll see if this will make that little black line I'm talking about. There it is right there. So when you use a diamond burr that is down to the shank, it will leave those metal marks. And that's the problem with the little double inverted cones that get worn out too quickly. So with the larger inverted cones, it keeps the edge longer, and it's less likely to actually kind of leave a black mark onto the fissure. So when you look at this one now, it will take that black line out that I just made on the other one. And what the idea of this isn't really to gouge it out or make it thinner, what it's doing is redefining the lines. So I very lightly touch this. It just sharpens up the fissure just a little bit more so that when I put the stain in there, it's going to look a little bit nicer. It's going to be a little bit more focused. Again, not a situation that you have to do, nor would you want to do this if you're at minimal thickness of your restoration, but still, it's not really gouging it out. If you measured this, it couldn't be hundredths of a millimeter difference. It just makes it slightly sharper. Okay, so going back to the turbo crown. Well, we got to put it on a post, and with the Emax system, you always want to make sure you use the largest post you possibly can. When it comes to Emax, you got to make sure you're putting it on the right end. So we're going to put the peg on this end, and then this circle goes into the tray. There's a lot of different options when it comes to peg material. Now, Ivoclar Vivadent makes object fix, and it comes in different types, a flow and a putty. One's a little bit runnier, but it's basically the same thing. This is what Ivoclar recommends. There are other manufacturers, like this is Quick Peg from Vita. There's many different kinds. There's pros and cons to it. So the object fix from Ivoclar, it's nice because when you put it inside the crown and fire it, when you're done, it comes out of the crown completely clean. I mean, you don't have to hardly do anything with it, so it's very easy to clean. The disadvantage to this is when you put it on the crown and put it on the post, it doesn't support the crown very well. So when you're painting stuff on it, you can push it off, so it doesn't have as much support. Now on the flip side, other pastes like this Quick Peg, it holds it to the post really well. I mean, here, watch, I'll show you. I'll just take a crown like this one. Put a lot in there, and then drive this into it. And what that just did is it supported all of my margins without having to go all over it. Now this is supported really well. I can shake this around and it's going to stay on the post, okay? Now if I do the exact same thing with the object fix, it works, but it just doesn't hold it quite as tight. Again, when you're squirting out the object fix, you want a lot out, because your goal is to just take the peg or the post and push it right into it. And if you do it fast enough, it will support the margins completely. So if you do it quickly, you'll see that the margins are supported completely. If you do it with just a little bit of material and kind of push it on there, now you've got to push it all up there. I'd rather just put extra on there and rock and roll, get it going. So now at this point, if I want to paint on this, I have to do it pretty quickly because the object fix dries out so quickly that it's going to start to crumble and it will come off the post quicker than what that Quick Peg does. Again, there's pros and cons to both ways. The object fix cleans out really well after it fires. The Quick Peg, you have to take a sandblaster and blast it out. It only takes seconds, but it is an extra step. So let's go to the turbo crown. So we got the sprue off. Oh, and always put the cap back on because we don't want this stuff to dry out. That's the last thing we want to do. So turbo crown, we just have a couple things. We have the number 2, and I'm going to use my all-time favorite, the Vita Kolinsky Sable 00 brush. I'm going to get just a little bit in through here. And what you're going to see is I have a lot of the material on the brush. Don't just get a little bit. And the other thing is you don't want to dab it. You want to take broad strokes with this. The reason for this is that the more action you put in this, more clumpy it's going to be. So I'm going to try to get this to where I'm getting all of the stain in one stroke. Now I know this looks like it's too much, but you have to remember when it goes in the oven, the stains will actually evaporate a little bit, and so it's going to have less chroma to it. But then the other thing is I'm just trying to get the stain down. I can always take some of the stain off. So as I'm wrapping this around and working it, again, long brush strokes, I know that I can always take some of this off. So I'll take my finger and wipe some of it off the brush, And I'm going to get this big clumpy thing off here. Now I'm tapering it down to the margin slightly and wiping it off towards the occlusal portion. And this is going to be just a hint of brown at the gingival third. So again, the trick is get it all the way onto the surface first and then start wiping it off. Other people use bigger brushes. I think smaller is the better. All right. Also, because of this is a lower second molar, we've got this nice little groove right here. This is a huge advantage to have these little grooves because you can take the stain and run it through that groove just a little bit, and it will make those cusps look a little bit more defined just by going into the groove. Okay. I don't like this little clump here, so I want to get that off. Okay, so we're not trying to spend a lot of time on this. I've already redefined the fissures. Take a little bit of the material, run it into the fissures, trying to keep it away from those cusp tips. Again, never be afraid to dry off the brush. So I'm going to take my fingers and redefine the brush and then make this less accentuated in certain areas. So if I had made those fissures more defined, it will go right into there. Now, this looks like there's quite a bit of color in here, but again, this is a turbo crown. Let me just go ahead and wrap this all the way around. Again, I'm trying to get the color on first, knowing that I can take it off later if it's too much. All right. And again, I keep getting this little yellow area. Let's get that little rascal up. There we go. That's looking better. And don't be worried about like some areas that'll maybe a little bit more intense than others, like in here. Like I'm missing just a little bit towards the margin there. Not a big deal. So I can just run that all the way through. But I think you can see the advantage of a very small brush, a 00 brush, because when I push this onto the restoration, it has very little give, but I can keep this extremely sharp and defined. So the next stage of this would be to put glaze on it. Now I know I've mixed all this glaze on here, and I could put that immediately over the top of it, but it would disrupt the areas that I put the brown. This is where we're going to do a combination where we're going to apply just a little bit of the number 2 brown down, and then we're going to use the Emax CAD crystallization glaze to put it over. Now if you dilute this too much, you could potentially have bubbles happen through the stain if you do this incorrectly. So I'm going to show you how to use the spray glaze. First thing is you gotta mix this up really well. There's a little bead in here and you have to hear it go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. You can't overmix this. Now as you're applying the stain, the instructions say you need to be about 10 centimeters away. Now I kind of think of it as hairspray. Not that I use hairspray on this this curly hair that I got going on today, but you use it like hairspray. But you're not going to put the hairspray around the head like this. You're going to turn the head as you apply the spray. So I'm going to gas this as fast as it will go and apply the spray glaze, 1, 2, 3, and then stop. What you don't want to do is this. Because every time you just spray, 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 you're releasing a lot of the solvent within the can and you're going to waste your cans. So you gas it and you turn the head, you turn the restoration. Once it's evaporated, then you do it again. Again, full gas and just turn the head. In the instructions, it's the Emax, in the instructions for the Emax CAD crystallization spray glaze, it says that you only have to do this twice. Personally, I think you need to do it one more time just for safe measure. Again, mixing it really well, holding it, turning it, and then allowing it to evaporate. So we're going to get this one fired up while we're doing another one. It's one of the easiest ovens to use. It's all pre-programmed, and you just hit program 3. Program 3 is the speed glaze. Now in the instructions it says don't use the stain with it. Now the reason why they say don't use the stain is because they're concerned that when you use the stain you have too much diluting liquid and it will evaporate too quickly. So the difference between the fast cycle and the regular cycle is how fast the clamshell comes down into it. So how fast you're introducing heat into the glaze. So as long as we didn't mix it too much, we didn't use too much material, which we didn't, we shouldn't get any bubbles on this at all. So I want to take this and put on the little tray, open this up. And a good habit to do also is always keep your oven on during the day, or you could probably turn it off after you know you're not going to use it for the rest of the day. But you should go ahead and turn it on at the beginning of the day because you want this oven hot. You want it ready to go. If you do your glazing and then turn the oven on and then put it in there, it's a cold oven and it's going to take longer. And plus, you want that muffle really hot before it started. Okay. So let's go to another restoration where we're going to jazz up just a little bit more, but we're going to do it with the liquid glaze rather than the spray glaze. So we're going to go back to my crown. Again, we've defined the fissures just a little bit. It doesn't have to be much. We just need a little bit so we can add some depth to it. Now, Ivoclar Vivadent recommends their crystallization posts, which you get in your kit when you buy the oven, or you can buy it separately. There's many different other posts too that you'll see in dental lab websites. This is a little firing tray that I've used. I bet I've used this 800,000 different times. In fact, you can see all the glaze on it. It's all kind of corroded, but it's shiny. And what's nice about this, it has multiple different posts to it. I think Ney, N-E-Y, the Ney company makes this. They do a lot in the dental lab world. And what you can do with this is you can do multiple restorations and you can hold it all at the same time. So I use this for our Emax restorations a lot. So I'm going to use the Object Fix. This is the putty. Again, a lot of material. This isn't a time to be too chintzy on this. And then you take this and put it right into one of those big posts. And if you do it fast, you'll see that the entire margin is now supported with very little effort. Again, always put the cap back on. Anyway, yep. Always put the cap back on, whether it's the Object Fix or like Quick Peg, because this stuff dries out very quickly. Be in the habit of putting that cap back on. So now what I like about this is I can hold the little tray and do multiple restorations at the same time. So we're going to jazz this up a little bit, but we're going to do this a little bit differently. I want to put the glaze down first and then put the stains. So instead of calling this staining and glazing, I like to call it glazing and staining because we want the glaze on top of it first, and then we're going to work the stains into it. So again, I'm always in the habit, I don't care if I just mixed this 5 minutes ago, I want to see this mixed one more time. And this is looking really good because it's barely holding a shape. Now, I'm going to take a big drop of this, okay? Don't take a little bit, because again, I want you to get in the habit of putting the glaze on and wiping it off, putting the glaze on and wiping it off, because you're going to get better results that way, in my opinion. So I'm going to take a big drop of this and distribute it around the smooth surfaces and then work it around. Again, I don't want to spend minutes and minutes and minutes on this, but if I barely put any glaze on this, it's going to take a lot more time. Again, a lot of glaze, and as you're working it around, you can always wipe it off on your fingers or wipe it on somebody walking by you that's driving you crazy. Get them out of here. But anyway, the point is more is better, and you can always take some of it off if you need to. I've gotten a lot of questions about, well, is it better to go from the margins up or is it better to come from the margins down? I'm afraid that I'm going to get glaze underneath my margin. Well, if you put the crown on the post properly with the material like I did really fast and with a lot of material, this isn't going to be an issue at all. But I mean, what's the worst that's going to happen? You're going to get a little glaze over your margin. And you know, when you etch it with hydrofluoric acid, you're going to see that the glaze surface doesn't etch. You can easily grind that off. Obviously, we want to avoid that situation, but if it happens, what's the worst that's going to happen? You're going to see it, and you can polish it off with a little diamond or a greenstone. And then on this, let's say I have my peg material properly placed. What's the worst that can happen if I get a little bit of glaze over it? After it fires, you're going to feel a little rough edge all the way around. You'll see it. It's going to take you seconds to polish it. So don't be too afraid of getting the glaze all the way to the margin, especially if you put your paste on there properly. Now, ladies, you definitely glaze better than us men, because what men do is they do this. They put the glaze on, they take a little dab, and then they dab it around. And they dab it around some more over here. Now, ladies, if you were getting your fingernails painted, would you want your fingernails painted like that? Now, the guys that are watching this video, don't answer that question, because I don't want to know if you paint your fingernails. But if you do, you just want to make sure you're doing it in smooth, broad strokes. So when you get your fingernails painted, which I've heard, not that I've ever done it, quit looking at me like that, but what I've heard is they put the paint down and then broad strokes. You're going to get a better surface area with that. Now on the occlusal surface, we want glaze, but we don't want too much glaze that's going to affect the occlusion. So again, don't be afraid to take the glaze off. I'm going to put some on here. Yes, this is too much. If we've just fired this and put it in the patient's mouth, they're going to feel that, and we're going to be grinding off our Picasso, which we don't want to do. But again, I don't want to have a non-glazed surface as well. So you put stuff on there and then wipe it off. And I just use my finger to wipe it off on. And what I'm going to see is, eventually, I'm not going to see any more glaze pooling up into the fissures. I want it wet, but I don't want it too much glaze on here. What I have found with doing this technique, you get a really nice glazed surface without adding to the occlusion, which nobody wants to do. All right, so we have a nice glazed surface on that. Now we're going to start introducing some of the colors. I mentioned earlier that the number 2 brown was my favorite, so we're going to take just a little bit of it, and it doesn't take much on this. I want to work it into that gingival third. Now I'm putting a little bit more on here than I normally would, just for the video's sake, so we can see it on the video. But you'll see that, again, if you don't put enough on after you fire it, it's gonna disappear. So you have to see it on here. The first few times you do this Emax, this blue, it's kind of intimidating because the crown is blue right now. I'm like, what is it going to look like? Well, maybe mill a couple of the Empress out or the other feldspathic like the Vita Mark II, and then do the same thing and get a test down on how much brown you actually need. So what I have found is that I just want a little hint of it, just enough to where I can see it. And again, I'm not quite to the margin, but I want to take that brush and go right to it, pushing it down. But again, this is a subtle color that we want to see on this restoration. We don't want it too defined. If it ever gets to the point where you're playing around on this and it's like, no, that's not looking so great, wipe it off. Take your brush, clean it off on your finger or a 2x2, and just wipe this sucker right off and clean it off. Start over if you feel like it's not looking good. So never be afraid to do that. Anyway, let's go back to getting some color on here. Again, use cusp to your advantage. So this is lower first molar. There's 3 cusps on the buccal. So there's this cusp, distal buccal, buccal, and mesiolingual cusp. So if you have too much of this stain in here, feel free to paint it all the way up through that little fissure right there, because it's going to give it more depth after you fire it. It'll make the cusp look like they're a little bit more separated. Oh, that doesn't look very good. I got it right over my cusp. Let me erase this. That didn't look very good at all. Okay, so I'm not doing a very good job, but this is a good learning thing. So I'm going to just wipe it off of that one cusp, get it right off of here, and then blend it out. You don't want to see real defined lines in those separation of the cusp here. So. Okay, so did a little bit of the gingival third. We're going to go into the occlusal area. Now, one trick is if you put something dark next to something light, it will appear to have more depth. So what does that mean? Well, anything that's farther away from me right now should look darker. So that means into the fissures. They should look darker. I'm just putting a little bit of that number 2 brown just to give a foundation for color. So it would be like Denton showing through. It takes just a second to do this. The whole time you're mixing it with the glaze. This is one of the only times you're really utilizing the glaze to mix with. One of the things you want in your arsenal is a number 20K file, not a broken one. Erase that memory when that file separated. Just get a brand new one. It'll last you your career doing this. It'll never wear out. And the greatest thing about this, it'll never separate when you're staining on this. But not an 8, not a 10 or 15. I know it seems like, well, I need to use as small of K file as I possibly can. The problem with it are, I think it's van der Waals forces. What happens is when you use the real small ones, the stain actually gets drawn up the tip and you can't get the tip down into the glaze. What I have found is a 20 actually holds the stain right on the very tip. So going back to our crown here, if there are areas that I want to redefine this, like I want to take this back in there, I'm just going to brush this down into that fissure, and I have more control over it than I did with that little brush. The brush was mainly just to get the color in there. But I'm going to add a mahogany here. Now, mahogany is awesome. This is mahogany. It comes in the Emax crystallization stains or the Empress. Again, it looks exactly the same. And I want to put this way, way far away. It's going to be hard to see on this black, but believe me, this stuff is super, super red. Do not dilute this. Let it be kind of thick. It needs to be a little bit wet. It can't be totally dried out, but we want to make sure this stuff stays right on the tip. So mahogany is on our black slab right here. It's kind of difficult to see, but it's very red. And you're going to take this 20K file and just take a little bit of a dot of this. And what you're going to see is that dot now stays on the tip. Like I said before, if it's a smaller K file, the stain tends to run up the file and it's really hard to get it into place. Our turbo crown is out. This is the one where we just put a little bit of stain on the gingival third and the occlusal surface and did a quick spray glaze. Always be in the habit after you take it out, obviously use your tongs, close the oven so you keep the heat within the muffle. Now, obviously, this is still super hot. We'll check this in just a minute, but we use a dot pull technique. You just put a dot into it and then you pull it through. And the idea is as you pull it through, you're making a very defined line. The problem what a lot of people do is they take mahogany and they put a dot and then they pull, thinking they're getting the color through it, but what you're seeing as this happens, you dilute that color. Not only that, you're making a bunch of wavy lines into here, and it doesn't look very sharp. Like this one looks a lot sharper with just one pull. Now, it's easy to get in that habit of pull, pull, pull. If you take a dry brush, so this is one of our 00 brushes, and you sharpen this up, you can redefine these little brushes, or you can redefine the lines. So if you go next to this little area that's too fat and just take this brush right next to it, what you're going to see is you sharpen it up without having to do it all over again. So I'm trying not to disrupt the line. I'm just trying to push it around. So I'm coming from one side and then coming to the other, and it redefines those lines better. Now when you go back to this original line here, I mean, that's pretty dark. If you fired that and put that in there, you're going to see a big stripe on this restoration. It may not be exactly what you're looking for or what the patient actually wants. So again, you can take one of these dry brushes. In fact, I'm going to go to my favorite Kolinsky Sable 00, sharpen it. I'm just going to sharpen it with my fingers here. And when you put this right next to it, you can redefine that line and you can pull it through. And that stain will stay where it's at as long as you don't go through it if you just go next to it. So you can see right here in that fissure, it's becoming thinner. And I'm wiping a little bit of it out. Again, this is a little bit thick for my preference on the occlusal surface, so I want to take this brush and wipe it through and redefine it. You'll find that you get some of the yellow out. It's okay, not a problem. You can always put more later, but I want to get rid of this little line. Now we're talking. Now that's more defined. So this line is kind of missing the fissure, so I'm just going to push it right back into place. And every time I do this, you're taking some of it out. So it's going to be more subtle, but if you start off with no stain in it, you're not going to see it at all. If you start off with too much, then it just looks like big chocolate swirls all on the occlusal surface, which we don't want. So you need to put some of it down. And I'm not finished with this. It's going to dilute even more. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to put something light next to something dark just to add some depth. So you can do this with a number of things. You can use the white stain. So Emax CAD and Empress both come in with white. All stain systems have a variation of white. And when you put this out, in fact, I'm going to put this right next to Mahogany. You're gonna see how really bright this is. White will get you into a lot of trouble. White goes a long way. When you put it on a restoration, you want to mix it within the glaze where you can't even see it. You just know you put some of it on there and it will make it look more opaque white like enamel does in the very thick areas, which would be like the cusp tips, marginal ridges, transverse ridges. Anywhere it's thicker, you want a little hint of white. But again, white goes forever. In fact, just this little dot of white would be enough for like 50 restorations. But another one that you can use that looks really good actually is the Emax Cerem Fluoro Glaze. This is a glaze material intended for Emax after you crystallize it, but you can use a little bit of this in the crystallization phase. But what I like about it is it has a lot of whiteness to it. So it's whiter than what standard glaze is. So this is the standard glaze. This is a little bit whiter. Again, you don't need too much of it. I'm going to go to another brush I didn't use. Always mix it. Make sure it's mixed properly. Now, because I'm only using this to accentuate certain areas, I don't need it mixed like I did my original glaze. So this could actually even be a little bit thicker. If you take a little bit of this and work it just right over somewhere thick, so this is an inclined plane, and I'm just getting a little bit of it out of the brush and pushing it down into that fissure, but not diluting the mahogany, what you're going to start to see is it starts to look deeper. I want to come from the other side, get a little bit of it out, and then just start pushing it down into where that fissure would be. And this is an optical illusion with that white right next to that mahogany. This is going to look like a deeper pitted fissure. Already you can start to see the depth in through here, and I don't really like this yellow here, so I'm going to get rid of that. I just contaminated my fluoro brush with a little bit of yellow. Not a big deal when you're doing this, because you can always take your hand and kind of wipe that out and then go back to it. But again, we want white wherever there's thicker areas. So the cusp tips, we'll just take a little bit of this fluoro, get it right on those cusp tips. Marginal ridge, and I got a little bit of sustain past that, so I'm going to erase that just a little bit. But now we have something that has a little bit of depth. It almost looks like it needs a diagonal dent to go through it to see what that fissure kind of cavity is going to be. Again, never be afraid of erasing something. So if you thought that was too intense, you can always take a brush and wipe it right off. But one little trick also is to go back to your 20K file and put it right into that mahogany and do the drop pull one more time. Not pull, pull, pull. Just very carefully trying to pull that mahogany into another line. So what that'll do is it'll give it a little less intensity right in that one area, but it starts to bleed into other lines and gives it a little bit more depth to it. Another thing you can do is like this little red dot, maybe a little too much for some people. Again, just go right next to it and rub to the side of it, and you'll define it even more. Now, I know you see kind of a yellow pooling right here. That's okay, because after it's fired, that will blend in extremely well. But the idea is we don't want to do too much. We've only added 3 colors to this. The number 2 brown, which was around the cervical, a little bit in the occlusal surface. Then we went mahogany right in the fissure, kind of blended that out. And then we used a white or a fluoro, Emax Ceram fluoro glaze in areas where it's thicker. And this is going to have tremendous depth and not be too crazy on the cavity scale for a new restoration. All right, so let's put this in the oven. Now, you want to select the program appropriate for the liquid glaze. So we're going to move over to program 1, which says the crystallization glaze. Takes just a little bit longer on this. And the reason why it takes just a little bit longer is it has to evaporate the diluting liquid. Because this is liquid glaze, there's more diluting liquid in it, and it takes a little bit longer for that to evaporate out. Put that right in the center, and then hit start. So we have the turbo crown out. What I want you to notice is that we have quite a bit of depth on this with really only using 2 things. It was the brown number 2, and then the spray glaze on top of it, just making sure we did it in enough coats, and you'll get a nice gloss to it. What you definitely don't want to do is over glaze it. One, you're going to add to the occlusion, and then also it's just going to look amorphic. At least this is going to feel really nice to the patient's tongue, and it's going to look nice when you put it in. The best part about having a glazed surface, though, is that when you bond these in, the bonding agent has a really hard time affixing to the glazed surface, so that's really nice. All right, let's take a hybrid abutment. So we have a restoration with a hole in it. We've got the sprue. Let's do this start to finish because I'm going to show you how to make kind of a gingival area and then also what to do around the hole. First thing we're going to do is get rid of the sprue. I want to move my stain and glaze out of the way only because I don't want a bunch of dust getting in on the glaze. Again, this is our sprue removal burr. You're going to see it takes this off very quickly. Going to the next layer here. If there's any shiny component to like a little rectangle on through here, it would still be the sprue, and we could go back to the white portion and take more of it off. Let's switch over to a high-speed handpiece with, again, an inverted diamond burr, inverted cone burr. We want to use this for a couple reasons. One, just to accentuate the little lines here. Again, we're not going deep into the fissures, just enough to sharpen them up. A lot of people get confused by this, thinking they're gouging it out. We're not. We're just sharpening it up. And one place to do this is in between cusp tips, right over the buccal cusp. And the way you do this, you use the flat end of the burr on this side, and then flip the crown around and do it on the other side. What you're going to find with that is that it makes a lot sharper planes on the cusp. Because in the CAD/CAM world, I mean, they mill beautifully, but they're kind of soft. They need to be sharpened up a little bit. So I refer to this as analog milling. There's analog milling, like I'm doing right now with the handpiece, and then there's digital milling. Digital milling is the milling chambers. So if you want to define these just a little bit sharper, taking one of these diamonds will help tremendously. Again, always turning the crown over so we can make a sharp angle on this buccal cusp. We're not just making a fissure, we're sharpening the angles of the cusp. In fact, whenever I'm doing this, I'm always thinking, don't think about the groove, think about the cusp you're trying to sharpen. And then a groove just magically starts to appear between them. So we'll get this lingual cusp done. Flip the crown around and do the other side. Always go over to the buccal or the lingual because it will look like a groove that isn't just on the occlusal surface, but it transverses over to that surface, and it will just redefine the cusp a lot better. So as you're seeing these two cusps, these two lingual cusps, they look a lot sharper than they would right out of the milling chamber. Another reason to use this bigger inverted cone is that, yes, you can make sharp lines with it, but you can also make slight little nuances, little depressions. So because this is such a big curve, I want to use the side of the burr and go up across things, and you can make little sluiceways. Remember that word from dental school, sluiceways? Sluiceways are something that would be in a cusp along an incline, something along a cusp along an inclined plane, and instead of making the line, we're going to draw it up. And it makes just kind of a softer little line into it. That's the reason why we like this burr so much. Okay. I've got a lot of dust and debris on that. Use my little alcohol. Again, we want to avoid any contamination, so just the polishing wheels and our diamond grit and the dust, we don't want to allow this to be contaminated. All right, so if we want to define kind of a gingival area on this, what I want you to do is look at the buccal and the lingual and decide, you may look at a picture or whatever, but decide where the CEJ starts and stops. So usually it's lower on the lingual and the buccal, and it comes up higher on the mesial and distal. And just like an occlusal fissure, I'm going to draw a little line here and slope it where it's continuous with the occlusal surface. Right? Now I'm not doing it hard, I'm lightly pushing this on here, but what this will do is it will define a line for the stain to stop. We're going to go higher up on an interproximal surface. So interproximally, this is the mesial surface. I want to be higher up, but on the distal, I want to drop it down, but follow the contour of the occlusal plane. Again, it looks like I'm just gouging a line in here, but really what I'm doing is just defining a line for the stain to end. This is so light, you probably wouldn't even feel this with your fingernail, but it'll give us the opportunity for a more defined line for our brown. So we just did the buccal, and we're coming to interproximal, so you're going to go higher up with it, and then drop it back down on the lingual, and then catch it with the other side of the line. Now again, when you look at this, this is so faint. On this video, it may look deeper than what it really is, but this is a very, very faint line. I could probably barely even feel that with my fingernail. Again, we want to get this dust off here. Now with the implant abutments, you have to use a very specific crystallization pin. And the trick to this is to get it over the pin without it touching. If that little pin touches the inside of this diameter of the hole, sometimes it will actually fuse to it and it will break off, or it'll actually crack the Emax when you pull it out eventually. So what I do is I carefully put this paste in, let it overflow. In fact, we should almost see it coming out the occlusal surface right here. You can always put the cap back on so it doesn't dry out. And then I'm going to push this in straight through, and if I feel it even a little bit, I want to go side to side with it, but I just want this to be on very passively. And I don't even care that a little bit of the paste has come out the occlusal surface. I'd really rather it not be touching this pin. It doesn't happen very often, but every now and then I've had these fracture. Now you may not be able to get it quite up to the surface underneath where the tie base is going to go up to it, but you can always lightly sand that off. So I'm not too worried about the post, or I'm not too worried about the peg material being right up to that flat surface. There'll be enough on there to protect it. Okay, so the first thing is I want to get our glaze mixed out. Again, it's still looking pretty runny. Again, just be in the habit of always mixing it first, because you want to see that it's still at the right consistency. Get a lot of it out. Again, this is one of the mistakes I think a lot of people make. They use just a tiny little bit of glaze and they try to make it work, whereas I want a lot of this material out so I can move it around. In big, broad strokes. Nothing, don't do anything tiny, because then it will look clumpy. All right, so if we take a very defined brush, like my favorite little 00 Kolinsky here, and we're going to run this right underneath that line. that line helps us keep the stain in their right place. It's going to look very much like the CEJ right over the root surface. If any of this putty gets in the way, just simply push it back. You use another dry brush just to pull this back. Now, as you're painting this, it may look like, wow, this is a little bit thicker over here, a little bit thinner. I mean, it's almost impossible to have a complete consistency unless you just caked the color all over it. You got to remember that this stuff is gonna fire and melt, and it's gonna have a blending effect on its own. So again, it's gonna become more consistent during the firing of it. It's going to help us make a transition from the root surface into the coronal portion of the restoration. Personally, I like it when it doesn't, it's not totally uniform, because this is going to be right next to gingiva. There's going to be nuances of colors, and it just makes it look less man-made, I think, when there's less true consistency all the way around. So I have a big, broad, round area. This is a perfect location to mix the glaze and the stain into it. If you define that line pretty well, it will stay right there within that boundary. And again, you're never going to get it totally consistent, but you want it just enough to where, hey, that's starting to look like a root. I missed a little bit in through here, but instead of getting more stain, I'm just going to blend this across it. Again, a big broad area. Get this stain and work it around. That line will help keep it in that same spot. All right, that's looking more defined. So again, we need to kind of do our turbo crown that we did on the other case, and a little bit of brown right in through the fissures. Okay, I know it looks like putting a lot of stain on this, which I am, because remember, you're going to paint it out. And I know I'm getting a little bit of this putty material. Always be in the habit of taking your brush and wiping things out. It's much better to have too much color in there and then wiping it out rather than trying to get just the exact amount of stain. It's almost impossible. So we always put a little too much, paint it out. You take just a little bit of that fluoro glaze. What you're seeing, I'm just putting it a little bit on my finger because I got a little too much on there. And just putting it right on where our cusp tip would be. Again, we're just trying to get depth. And I'm mixing it around the cusp tip, because if I put too much on here and don't mix it, it's going to actually stay on there and be like a little point. And that will definitely be high in occlusion. But this will give depth with the more darker color, the number 2, with the fluoro glaze, or again, you can use white on the cusp tips. And this is going to be looking really natural. Remember, on these implant abutments or these hybrid abutments, there's only one peg system you're going to use, the very small pegs, and you're going to use this little round one where there's just the 2 slots. Looks like our other restoration is coming out. This is the one where we gave it a lot more color. We gave it a little bit of a mahogany, a little bit of yellow, and also the fluoro right on the cusp tips. And what you're going to see, all that color that it looked like I was putting on before, it's actually going to burn out a lot. And it's just going to be a hint of color all the way around. The mahogany is even going to be toned down just a little bit, so it's not going to be quite as intense. I highly suggest you making 2 or 3 molars with different variances of that mahogany so you can get an idea on what that fissure is actually going to look like after it's fired, so you have some reference in that. All right, so that cycle is finished. Put that here. Remember, always shut the door so you can keep the heat contained within the muffle. And this is still pretty hot, but we'll take a look at it. So now what you're seeing is that white next to the mahogany. I mean, that is going to have a lot of depth. And then just the little bit of gingival third all the way around. It's just subtle. You know, when we're making our fissures, we just want to make it just enough to where it looks like the cusps were separated and it's looking like a natural tooth in there.